Salam and peace. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and you're watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, which covers United States, Canada, and Mexico. 57 million subscribers there. Also on Apple TV, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and our own website, muslimnetwork.tv. It is 24/7 television, which is airs and streams on these places, and it's the only television that Muslims are host, and conversation is about everything which concerns our country. Gun violence has been increasing for a while, but now gun sales in the major swing state has nearly doubled this year. Actually, some of the popular guns are flying off the shelf, no longer available. It looks like just like the toilet paper before, as the pandemic was coming in. Malaysia's civil war fears are prompting gun purchases and gun sales among Black Americans as well. Then there is a stunning plot of some Malaysia allegedly hatching a plot to kidnap Michigan governor and overthrow the state government. Hasn't seen that in the news before. Is America any more violent than other countries and other societies? What can we do to prevent election-related violence? Is it a real fear or just a little bit of anxiety about that? I have been worried somewhat, being a peacemaker, leading interfaith movement, and being a Muslim in America, praying for peace actually 5 times a day. Anytime I stand up for prayer, I end my prayer for peace, prayer of peace, which Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, used to use. So initially I thought maybe I should try recruiting President Bush and President Obama to have a commission, official commission, to supervise the fairness and authenticity of elections. But when I started talking to Democrats, they were jumping on it. When I talked to my Republican friends, they said, Malik, you can offend Republicans by trying to do that. They will never buy into this. Then I thought, let me see if I can get 100 faith leaders to agree to that. And faith leaders say, well, we don't get involved in these type of things. So that whole idea of launching a movement for America to stand up for this thing didn't quite work. So worried, what do you do when you're worried? You Google things. So I Googled it. And at that time, when I Googled a couple of months ago, all I could find is election-related violence in other parts of the world. Nothing about America. And that's where I thought, well, Carter Center goes around looking for fair election observation. Maybe they will have something. And that's how I connected with the Carter Center, that they do have a program. And we discuss it. We offered that training on, and we connected with a whole lot of people who are equally concerned about it. And since the Carter Center was established by our beloved former President Carter, I thought it's a right place. So connecting elections abroad and now elections at home and all that. I'm glad I called. So every day seems to bring a new challenge for democracy in America. And maybe it will make us better citizens. Maybe it will make it more equipped to deal with violence, which goes on in our country anyway. More people are voting. Actually, more people have voted before the presidential debate yesterday than in 2016. Actually, double the number of 2016 at that time have already voted. So hopefully that is going to good. So today we will discuss not election as much as election risk of risk of violence and what we can do about it, and what is the role our distinguished guest in that regard. And I would invite first Professor Hrair Balian. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you.
Hrair Balian is a director of conflict resolution program at Carter Center. He's also a former professor at Emory University Law School. And I will invite Professor Scott Keck. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you for having me.
Scott is professor at Trinity College in Connecticut. He's currently at work on the political culture of violence in the United States. And finally, a major trainer, a person who is highly rewarded expert in this field, is Dr. Gary Slutkin. Welcome to Muslim Network TV, Professor.
Thank you, Imam.
Well, I call you professor. Are you a professor as well?
I was.
Okay.
You can call me Gary. Would be great.
Gary. So Gary Slutkin is an epidemiologist, the founder and CEO of Cure Violence, which is the name of an organization. And he formerly worked for World Health Organization. Gentlemen, I hope you're more comforted by yesterday's debate. I hope some of you watched that.
Yes. What was comforting, for me at least, what was comforting yesterday evening was the fact that it was a far more civil discussion than we experienced during the first debate a few weeks ago, when everybody was just screaming over, the two sides were screaming over each other without listening to each other at all, it seemed. But yesterday it was much more civil. That was encouraging.
Scott, you being a historian, do you remember any debate in the history of debates who was like a debate we had, first debate?
Well, that, if you can call it a debate, that is a generous term.
Okay.
No, I mean, that was not the norm for American presidential debates. And I think that's why many people came away so discouraged and so uncertain about where we might wind up in the next, what was supposed to be two debates and has wound up to be one. I would echo what was just said, that, there was a measure of civility that was laid out that one would hope would portend to a more civil election period that we're about to head into.
So if two more debates, considering the second was cancelled, the first one was, you're not willing to consider it's a debate, but a wrestling. In wrestling match, people don't shout at each other, but I'm glad they didn't go that far. So if we do two more debates, do you think our country will have little more comfort about our leadership? What do you think, Gary, about that?
I don't feel that I saw a debate. And the whole situation is abnormal. And the tone was still extremely accusatory and not really enlightening or facilitating a positive view. So I'd rather see a different type of conversation myself. And we have a long way to go.
Unfortunately, and these are our leaders, these are not two of us on the street, these are our leaders, and that sort of saddened me so much. Little bit about me, I'm not I came here 40 years ago, and I had a better house and better car, but I didn't have as many freedoms. I read constitutions of the world, I think 10 countries, and I chose this country. I'm glad I read the constitution with its amendments, not the one earlier one. And I came here for freedoms. I sometimes feel, I don't know whether it's appropriate word. Sometimes I feel cheated of what is happening in our country right now. And I say, oh my God, did I make all those sacrifices of leaving family and friends and everything was good for me. I mean, I was not, I was thankful to God Almighty there, except I was looking for more of the freedoms. So I understand the pain all of us feel. What is the possibility, Gary, of election-related violence? I mean, since you have, you're working on it and you're teaching people how to prevent, do you think there is a possibility of violence is real, or it is just anxiety level we have?
Well, I think it's certain. And not just the election itself, I mean, the day of and the day after and the weeks or months, it's certain. It's just a matter of how much. The violence in this country, besides community violence and other things that we've normalized or have gotten more used to, these rage killings or violence against groups has been increasing, and mass shootings have been increasing very, very gradually, but now it's getting on a steeper curve since the 70s, actually the late 60s. And it's been going up and up and up. And even before this current administration and even before the 2016 election, people who are looking at some of the events and factors predicted a lot of violence around now and to follow. So we have a lot of work to do. I mean, there's reasons for this, the trends, there's reasons for it, but the most important thing is that we all mobilize to prevent its spread and prevent events and prevent further events.
Hrair, how when did Carter Center get involved in U.S. election-related violence prevention?
This is something very new to us, getting involved in violence prevention or electoral issues in this country. And the reason for that is because we are concerned. Just like many, many, many Americans and the people on this panel are concerned about the future of this country and the potential, the possibility, the certainty, perhaps even, of violence around the election. And I must add that the violence that we see coming is not necessarily only related to the elections, but predates the elections to much, much deeper societal, cultural identity issues with which this country has been struggling. We've worked in many other countries around the world on preventing violence. And before we get involved in those countries, we look at certain indicators, early warnings that something is off in a given place and an intervention is needed. And without an intervention, the country is sliding down the slippery slopes of violence. What are those indicators? And it would be good to take a look at some of those indicators because we have started to see those indicators in this country, the early warnings in this country. And that's the reason why we got involved. We look at, just to give two examples, we look at how the different sides of a dispute are treating each other. Are they dehumanizing the other side so that then when they take action, that action is justified? It is not an action against the human side, but something less than human on the other side. Are they looking for winning all, the winner taking everything, rather than leaving something for the other side as well and finding some sort of a bipartisan or multi-partisan agreement among the various sides of a given divide, whatever that divide may be? And we're starting to see a lot of these signs appear in this country. And that's the reason we got really concerned and started looking into this. I came to this country 50 years ago. I immigrated to this country 50 years ago from Lebanon. I never thought that I would be escaping from conflict in Lebanon. I never thought that I would be concerned about violence in this country. And here we are.
Gary, how your connection with Carter Center came into being?
Well,
I've been working on violence prevention, conflict resolution for the past 30 years around the world, as I said earlier. And I joined the Carter Center almost now 13 years ago. It had always been a dream of mine to join the Carter Center. I always admired the work that the center was doing, and in particular the work that President Carter and everything that President Carter represented, really. And there was an opportunity 13 years ago, and I applied, and they accepted me. So here I am at the Carter Center.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Dr. Gary Slutkin, you're a epidemiologist, and how you got connected with the Carter Center as well as the work which you do.
Well, I mean, so these are two questions. So yes, I'm an epidemiologist. I'm a physician by training. My background is having worked on epidemics, mostly in other countries, mostly in Africa, also in Asia. And I worked on epidemics like tuberculosis and cholera, and I worked with the Global Program on AIDS, helping to set up the first AIDS programs in Central and East Africa. I've lived in Somalia and in other countries. I left there as they were descending into civil war. But largely I was working on these other types of problems. I moved back to the United States about 20 years ago to take a break from that kind of work. I saw violence around me in this country. I had no idea the extent of it. I was blind to what the country really was in a certain extent and what was happening. And I began to look at violence anew. And I looked at the charts and graphs and maps, and it looked to me just like any other epidemic disease. And then we created a new model for reducing violence, which is the Cure Violence approach, which is the community people managing the epidemic themselves. And it's been very successful. We're working in 100 communities in several continents. A lot of work, though, in the US and Latin America, and some in the Middle East. Our connection with the Carter Center and Hrair specifically has been around the Middle East work that we worked on together in Syria and the surrounding countries, where we did a number of trainings, did a number of interruptions, and piloted a piece of work to work at violence reduction in a conflict zone, not just on the ground with community partners, but also at exploring how to work at a higher level with leaders as well. So and now we matched up again for working on the U.S. situation. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to work with Hrair and the Carter Center. As Hrair mentioned, the Carter Center is so well respected, so experienced, so nonpartisan. It's just the way we in health approach things is nonpartisan and neutral.
It's good. You probably noticed both of the other gentlemen were working on violence around the world, not in America. But one way or the other, their focus is coming back to America. But you're a historian. What is the history of political violence in our country?
So let me bounce off a little bit where Gary was leaving off, as both of these groups are nonpartisan groups, of course, working against violence. Some of the origins, though, of American violence are in partisanship. And so as I'm listening to this conversation, I'm thinking about the 1830s, the 1840s, the moment when the electorate, the white male electorate in the United States was expanded to nearly almost every white man. And at that moment, if you were around on election day, you would have seen several things. You would have seen incredible parades, right? Partisan parades. Each political party, kind of running down the town with a big parade and celebration. There would have been a lot of alcohol drinking, but there also would have been a lot of eye poking, eye gouging, punching. Violence against one's political opponents was somewhat the norm, particularly in the 1840s, as the nation becomes a more fractured political system. And so, I think about these moments, and I try to reflect then, of course, on our current moment. And to a degree, right, we don't see some of that. However, if we're going back to the 1840s and 1850s, American leaders in Congress would bring their guns. They occasionally even shot each other in Congress. I mean, the most famous incident in Congress is the beating of Charles Sumner in the 1850s. But there was a lot of regular intimidation and violence as part of the political process, both kind of among everyday voters, everyday Americans. Of course, only men were voting at the time, but also among its leadership. And then from that violence, and we've talked about gun violence a few times, and I've been thinking about, there was this moment in the 2016 election where a woman went to the poll in Virginia, and she reported, a political opponent was standing there with a gun, muttering that she was voting for crooked Hillary, right? And you start to think, okay, we know we have a gun violence problem. What is allowed and what isn't allowed at a voting place in the United States. And there have been these conversations about violence in polls going back to revolutionary America. In 1778, right, Maryland bans guns at election sites. They also ban militiamen from coming as a group together to vote. These things were seen as intimidation, right? And they wanted to free the election from that. But that's just, there are a handful of states who do that. There are other states who allow guns, and that actually stays true to today, where there's only kind of one overriding national law in place that can somewhat prohibit guns at polling places, and that is the Gun-Free School Act from 1990. So if voting is happening at a school, technically, you can't bring your gun to a voting site in the United States in 2021 or 2020, whatever year we're in. It's been a long year. But otherwise, it varies by state, right? Some states ban, some states that have that allow unconcealed carry ban you from bringing it to a voting place, like Arizona. Other states allow you to bring it to a voting place as long as it's not a school, usually. This local local oversight of what can and can't be done during a national election is a legacy that I think does actually help permit and foster violence, particularly in moments of great partisanship.
You're watching Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Dr. Gary Slutkin, Hrair, Balian, and Scott Geck, and we'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and we're talking with Dr. Gary Slutkin, Hrair, Balian, and Scott Geck. All of them are professor or have been a professor. Well, thank you so much for being with us. I would ask Gary, little bit of more of a connection between epidemiology and prevention of violence. I mean, how you're inferring. I know there are documentaries about explaining your thing. Can you give us 101 of that?
Yeah. So violence behaves exactly like a contagious disease. Exactly. And it meets the definition of disease because it has characteristic signs and symptoms causing death, or disability, like that's the definition of disease. and it meets the definition of contagious because it is a risk factor for itself. In other words, it causes more of itself. One event leads to another. The greatest risk factor for violence is a preceding violent event. The same thing for COVID. The greatest risk factor for COVID is being exposed to COVID, or being exposed to flu for flu, exposed to TB for TB, exposed to violence for violence. And it's dose dependent. The more you're exposed, the more your friends are doing it, the more you saw it as a kid, the more likely you are to do it. So what's actually happening is that your brain is taking in, it has mechanisms for copying, and it has mechanisms for ensuring that you do what your friends do. And these are very useful phenomenon for when we were on the savannah. And that's how we learn most things, what our parents and then our friends do. But your brain is causing more of what it sees and does, just like your lungs replicate COVID or a pneumonia, or your intestines replicate cholera. Now, we tend to think of our brains as more like we're making decisions and all of this kind of thing. But actually, most of what we're doing is kind of semi-automatic copying, and we copy violence. So, and then when you look at the curves of violence, you see the escalation, whether it's community violence, mass shootings, suicides, war, violence-related protests.
Gary,
so
if
it behaves like a contagious disease. And what we've also shown, and this is the Institute of Medicine has documented this as well. There's hundreds of papers written on this now. And we've also shown that treating it in this way, other than in the punitive way, treating it as a process that can be interrupted by health workers, we call them violence interrupters, outreach workers, behavior change agents, specialist workers, that you can drop violence down 40 to 70%. And there's 13 places where it's been dropped to zero in the US and in Latin America through an epidemic control approach rather than what we've been doing.
So, well, but we are in the middle of pandemic. More than 200,000 people in US only have died. There is a CDC, there is a realization. Television is talking about, media is talking about, it takes good part of our presidential debates. Why this thing does not have a center, a command center like the CDC? Is there a tolerance in our society towards violence, so nobody wants to worry about it? I would consider the Cure Violence, your organization, to be, serve as a command center where people are thinking, people are connected, constant guidelines are going out for individuals, what they can do, for communities, for businesses, what they can do, what government can do. Have we become immune to violence in our country?
Well, if we were immune, that would be great. But what I really think you're saying is, have we accepted it as normal? And that's what's incorrect. We've accepted this as, this is the way it is, this is the way people are, this is the way it is in my neighbor, this is the way, and this is really wrong. And you can see, even with COVID, people are starting to accept it as it's just the way it is. And that's what happens. That's what we at WHO, AIDS was starting to get accepted in Africa with all of these deaths. And this is what we at WHO, with World Health would do. We'd come in and say, wait a second, there's methods here. Let's activate and use them and reverse this and stop the deaths.
So let's talk about what people can do to prevent that. Institutions. Let's talk about what institutions can do before we go on talking about individuals. Any idea there?
I think all institutions in this country and leaders in this country, starting with the two main candidates, they have a responsibility to call for calm. for calm every single day from today on to until the results are known, and even after the results are known.
Even after that.
It has to start from the leadership. The leadership of this country has a responsibility. Former leaders of this country have a responsibility to call for calm. And every single one of us have a responsibility to calm our surroundings. Reporters, journalists have an enormous responsibility not to pour fuel on the flame already starting to burn.
Are you organizing any training for journalists and media people?
We are, as we speak now. I think we've got one session with journalists. We have several sessions training sessions addressed to journalists. First of all, to help them understand better the whole electoral process, and then to not to spread false information, not to panic on the first sign of a problem somewhere, because elections always are problematic. This year, a lot more than in previous years. But we all have the responsibility to remember that this country has managed elections and transitions in an orderly fashion in the past, and there's no reason why we should not be able to do it now. I'm not saying that the electoral process in this country is perfect. It is not. It is far from perfect. We've got all sorts of problems, but there are ways that we can address most of those problems without resorting to violence, because violence is not going to solve any of the problems related to the elections, any of the problems pinning the tensions in this country even before the elections, and will continue after the elections. So we have to, each one of us have a role to play.
Dr. Gary Slutkin, do you feel that enough institutions in our country, based on approaches to you, are they approaching you, are they connecting with you, want to learn? Is there a desire on the part of our institutions to foresee and prevent?
Well, it's kind of yes and no, and certainly not enough. So, I mean, Cure Violence is working with about 20 cities in the U.S. There's hundreds of these workers, violence interrupters, outreach workers, it's in the city budget in several cities, notably New York and others. But the paradigm of how to reduce violence now is still a policing punishment approach, and it comes from an idea that the people who are doing it are quote unquote bad, and this is partially or largely racist. But beyond the racist part of this, there's a misunderstanding of the problem itself. We had the same, and this is what Hrair was talking about in part is so essential to this, because the view of this problem is off. And when I was working at World Health, the director went to journalists as such, and you yourself are a journalist by nature of this show in a way. And so we need the media to educate, not just report on the problem and the events, but as you're doing now, to educate the public as to, in a way, the new way of seeing this problem, and as we're starting to get into what everyone needs to do, the institutions. I mean, the cities need to develop these new, so this is part of what the Black Lives Matter protest, the social movement protest, is about. We want something other than policing. Well, where do you go? Cure Violence has something other than policing, not just us, that reduces violence. Why isn't that happening more fully? Is because of what we just said, is that people are viewing the problem as, well, we need to know what to do with those people. What they're doing is coming from the wrong idea in the first place about violence. The right idea is that it is a contagious problem managed very well by trained specialists in violence reduction, such as violence interrupters and outreach workers. And the view of the people needs to be that they basically have a health problem of having seen too much of it and having been traumatized too much, all of which can be interrupted and stopped.
Professor Scott Geck, tell me this, historical insight. I mean, you shared amazing fact while people going on the eyes of each other on the election day. Do you think there were the rhetoric and the violence was part of leading towards civil war?
Absolutely. And so one of the things that I found so discouraging is that there is this, I've seen it repeated in media outlets over and over, is that there has never been a non-peaceful transfer of power in the United States. And there's one, of course, really glaring example. There have always been a kind of, if you would, peaceful transfer of the presidential chair, right? A president has always vacated for the next president. But the election of 1860, which leads to the transfer of power to Republicans and Abraham Lincoln in 1861, was highly contested, and 700,000 people wind up dying in the next few years as a result. So I don't predict that going forward, although people have talked, of course, about civil war. But there is a unique way in which the narratives of violence in the United States all tend to be very forgetful. And so I was thinking about this earlier when Gary was talking about the medicalization of violence, right? Understanding it as a disease. And Gary, you can please correct me if I'm wrong, but the Surgeon General, it's in the Clinton years, right, declares violence as an epidemic in the 1990s. It might have even been C. Everett Koop. I could be wrong on that. I mean, this has been acknowledged publicly, from one of the highest medical voices in the United States, and we have not, as a national project, taken up that message and instituted funding which could begin to combat this disease. And I think that happens, both on a kind of political narrative, in a way of a political narrative of, we've never really had a violent past, which is untrue, but also just in terms of violence in everyday lives. It's not wanting to associate with it, which also helps you just kind of feel better about the country you live in, but also, hurts going forward, right? You're not going to address a problem that exists. Like, I think it's 2010 when the United States passes that awful marker of there are more privately owned guns in this country than there are citizens. We should have a real conversation about that. Like, do we need that many guns? Like, there's a Second Amendment. I think we can't doubt that. But we can definitely have a bigger conversation about how we should have, how those guns should be held and how many should somebody have. But those are poisonous conversations that need to shut down.
Another very difficult conversation. We'll take a short break, but before we take a short break, Gary, do you think, yes or no, would you say that fewer guns will result fewer level of violence?
Well, of course. I mean, because if there's less availability of cigarettes, there's less smoking. If there's less cola around, there's less drinking of Coke. So you reduce the availability of a product that's used less. But the guns aren't the problem. The problem is that there's a culture that's asking for the guns. And we have dropped the violence 50, 60, 70% in places where the guns already are very plentiful. And so I just want to add to Scott's point here. The World Health Organization has a division of violence prevention. The Center for Disease Control has a division of violence prevention. It's very clear There's thousands of studies that show violence is primarily a health problem. We just have not shifted the paradigm. There's hundreds of studies that show that violence is a contagious health problem, and there are now past 100 studies that show that treating it and managing it in this way works better than and without these so-called side toxic effects of the existing way of going about it. So this is established, as well as it's established that the earth goes around the sun, but it took a while for everyone to accept that.
Oh boy.
That's where we are.
Please don't tell me it will take that many centuries. You're watching Muslim Network TV. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Muslim Network. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Professor Gary Slutkin, Professor Hrair Balian, and Professor Scott Gett about possibility and prevention of electoral-related violence in our country. We have just 9 minutes left, and I'd like you to focus on what individuals can do. What is the responsibility of individuals as we are heading and quite worried about that our country might have a higher level of violence? What an individual can do. I mean, expectation from institution is one thing, but what an individual can do. Gary, you want to go first on this?
Yes. Separate out all these other things that are on your mind. You know, who's going to win? Is the election valid or not? You want social reform or not? Whatever. And just look at violence as an epidemic process and realize that you can interrupt the spread of it, including the emotion of it and the speech of it. So, one, don't get drawn in to the speech of it or into the actions of it, whether you're in a protest or don't get drawn in, don't get pulled in. Keep yourself safe and do not do anything that increases the tensions and that increases violence. Because anything you do that stops something by cooling somebody down or cooling a friend down, changing their language, and stops the spread where you are.
So, is there any advice to individuals soaked into the historical knowledge Professor Scott has?
I would go off of what Gary said, and you know, de-escalation is certainly should be front and center, and that. But to bounce back to earlier point, that can also come from leadership, and so, you know, seek out leaders who are also de-escalating, because that might make a good pairing.
Do you think, Hrair, if President Carter makes a personal call to President Bush and initiate a request signed by all the former presidents, there are not many left, and it is publicized and discussed what people can do individually and what institutions can do to save lives, do you think that will matter?
As I said earlier, every single one of us, leader or ordinary citizens, we have a responsibility to call for calm. The former leaders of this country, former presidents of this country can take this a long way in calming the situation down if they made a public statement individually or jointly. Doesn't matter really. But let's not forget also that this is an election we're talking about. And each one of us, our first responsibility is to go out and vote. To go out and vote. Let's not forget the voting when we're talking about violence. Let's not forget the fact that our votes mean something and will count towards something. It's really significant not to be intimidated. It's really important not to be intimidated and go and vote. That's our first responsibility. Second, let me add one more responsibility that we have. We all use social media. We are, in fact, now using social media to reach out to large number of people, millions of people around the country. We have the responsibility to think before we share something that we see on social media, because there's so much lie, so much misinformation, so much disinformation on social media that throws fuel on the fire, that we have to think before we push that button to send whatever it is that we're sharing on social media. Think about before you do. And the third point I want to make on our responsibility is a lot of the people listening today are preachers, are imams, are faith leaders around the country. You faith leaders have huge responsibility and huge credibility with which you can speak to your congregations. And please use your pulpit to tell your congregation to stay calm, to be patient for the results to come in when they come in, and it may take time before the results come in this time around. Preach patience and calm, and for every person in your congregations to go out and do the same thing among their family members, among their friends, and among their circle of people they know. Go ahead.
Gary, do you think this concept of different people joining forces, clergy issuing, say, 100 of clergy, not only sermons, but signing a document and releasing publicly a solidarity statement between evangelicals and liberal churches and things like that, or 1,000 physicians coming out with their appeal, professors coming out, 200 professors asking, do you think, and we have the genre of influencers nowadays. The influencers on social media, they are moving millions and here and there. Do you think that type of thing will help people in some way of preventing and being part of, interrupting violence?
Yeah, very much so. In fact, there needs to be everybody speaking up, and there needs to be universal training on what violence really is and how to not be involved and how to stop it. But I really want to additionally echo what Hrair said, and I was going to add it, and I'm so glad we're in a way saying it twice. The clergy, the faith leaders are really critical for the country now to be on the side of cooling people down and getting involved in outreach. As we're doing with you and your network, we're having a training on Sunday at 4 o'clock Eastern time, primarily for the Interfaith Network. The clergy are critical at this time, actually in most and many epidemics, but in particular this one, because we need for this spiritual voice to help us in the transformation and the healing, the mourning of our losses, the healing, and to bring everybody really into the fold of designing and developing a more peaceful world. So the clergy are critical.
So the training which Professor Gary Slutkin is talking about, this training is on 25th as well as 29th, and you can register for it at soundvision.com/trainings. It is being offered by Dr. Gary Slutkin, who is the leader of Cure Violence, in cooperation with Carter Center. And Sound Vision and Charter for Compassion is trying to inform people about that. So you will be able to find, and I hope our producer will put a line there on the screen as editing about where people can register for that. Well, I would like to thank all of you. Three professors, extraordinary work which you are doing. My heart goes out for your work. This is something which we all need to learn. Our society as a general need to know. I mean, it's not election related. It was happening before. It may continue after. The culture of violence, which they are talking about, the history of violence in our country tells us that this thing can happen. If it can happen, that culture allows it, guns are plenty, new or the old. So each one of us have interest to make our society better, take it forward towards peace, not hurting each other. It starts with our words, but one of these guys who is sick enough uses the trigger. Peace, salam. You have been watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and Apple TV. And with me were Dr. Gary Slutkin, Hrair Balian, and Scott Gay. And thank you, Sherdil Khan, for organizing today's show. Peace and salam. Be safe.